If you had asked me back then, I would have told you we were one of the responsible couples. We weren't flashy. We didn't live above our means. We had a joint savings account, a plan, and conversations that sounded mature enough to convince me everything was under control. My husband liked to say, "We're good with money," and I believed him, mostly because I wanted to. He handled the finances, not in a controlling way, at least not on the surface. It just happened that way. He paid the bills. He checked the accounts. He liked spreadsheets. I trusted him. That trust felt normal, comfortable, like something married people are supposed to have. Every now and then, I'd ask casually, "How are we doing?" And he'd answer just as casually, "We're fine. Savings are solid." Fine, solid, no reason to worry. We talked about the future like it was already half built. Maybe a bigger place one day, travel, security, the kind of vague optimism couples have when they think time is on their side. Looking back, I realized something important. I never saw the numbers, not because he hid them outright, but because I never insisted. I didn't want to seem suspicious. I didn't want to be that wife, the one who checks behind her husband's back like she's waiting for him to mess up. So I stayed hands off, and silence around money felt like stability. At least, that's what I told myself. Our marriage didn't explode. It slowly cooled. Conversations became shorter. We stopped planning and started coexisting. No big fights, just distance that grew so gradually. It felt normal until one day it didn't. When we finally talked about divorce, it was calm. No screaming, no accusations, just two people admitting something wasn't working anymore. "We'll keep this clean," he said. "We'll be fair." I agreed. I remember thinking, at least this part won't be ugly. I assumed that whatever we had built together would be divided the way adults divide things. Honestly, transparently, without games. What I didn't know was that by the time we sat across from each other talking about separation, the damage had already been done. Quietly, patiently, on purpose. And the money I thought was waiting for the next chapter was already gone, if I'm being honest. The way our marriage ended almost made me feel relieved. There was no chaos, no screaming matches, no slammed doors or explosive arguments that left you shaking afterward. It felt adult, muted, like we were handling something difficult with maturity. That's what I told myself. Anyway, we sat at the kitchen table one evening, the same table where we'd once talked about vacations and savings goals, and admitted what had been hovering in the air for months. "I don't think we're happy anymore," he said. I nodded. I had been thinking the same thing but didn't know how to say it out loud without sounding like a failure. "We've just grown apart," I added. He agreed quickly. Too quickly. Maybe. But at the time, I took that as clarity, as mutual understanding. We talked about divorce the way people talk about logistics. Calm voices, practical words, no emotions spilling over the edges. "We can do this peacefully," he said. "No lawyers fighting," I replied. "We'll split things fairly," he promised. Fairly, that word mattered to me. I wasn't trying to punish him. I wasn't trying to win the divorce. I just wanted out without losing everything we had built together. I assumed fairness was the default when two adults decided to end a marriage respectfully. I remember telling a friend later, "At least it's not messy." She raised her eyebrows and said, "Sometimes quiet is messier." I laughed it off. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. We filed. We told people. We agreed to stay civil. He even thanked me for being reasonable. "You're handling this really well," he said once. I took that as a compliment, as proof that I was doing the right thing. During those weeks, I didn't look at our savings account. Not closely. Why would I? The divorce wasn't finalized yet. Nothing was being split. In my mind, the money was just there, waiting. We still lived in the same house, carefully orbiting each other. He spent more time out. I spent more time in my head, thinking about what came next, where I'd live, how I'd start over. At night, I lay awake planning a future that depended on resources I assumed existed. Security, a cushion, a safety net. That's the thing about trust. It lets you sleep. I remember one specific moment, standing in the kitchen alone after he'd left for the evening. I opened the fridge, not because I was hungry, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The house felt empty in a way that was unfamiliar, like it was already preparing for my absence. I thought, this is sad, but it's clean. I had no idea that while I was grieving the end of a marriage, something else was happening underneath the surface. Something that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with numbers. The divorce wasn't messy because the mess had already been hidden, and the silence I mistook for respect wasn't peace. It was cover. I didn't discover the problem in a dramatic way. No alert, no phone call, no moment where everything suddenly went quiet and heavy like in the movies. I found it on an ordinary afternoon, doing something I should have done a long time ago. I was sitting at my laptop, updating my budget. Divorce has a way of forcing you to look at numbers you've avoided. Rent estimates, moving costs, what I could afford on my own. I needed to know exactly where I stood. So I logged into our joint savings account. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't suspicious. I expected to see the number I'd seen in my head 100 times, the one we talked about casually when we mentioned being okay or having a cushion. The page loaded. I refreshed it once, because I thought it hadn't loaded correctly. Then I stared. The number wasn't just lower than I expected. It was wrong. Not slightly off. Not, oh, we spent more than I realized. Wrong in a way that made my stomach tighten. I checked the account name, checked the last updated date, logged out, logged back in. Same number. For a moment, my brain tried to protect me. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe there was a transfer I forgot about. Maybe this is just how much we had. I pulled up old emails, old notes, texts where we'd talked about money in passing. I didn't need exact figures. I just needed confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. There was a gap, a big one. Money that should have been there wasn't. My heart started beating faster, not in panic, but in that cold, focused way your body reacts when something important doesn't make sense. I scrolled through the transaction history. That's when I saw it. Withdrawals. Not one big one. Not anything obvious. Small amounts. Regular. Spread out over time. Transfers labeled vaguely. Numbers that wouldn't raise alarms unless you were really looking. I hadn't been really looking. I sat back in my chair and felt something sink into place. This didn't happen overnight. This happened quietly, deliberately. While I was still married, while I still believed we were partners, while I trusted him to handle our money the way he said he was. And suddenly, a thought hit me so hard it made my chest ache. He didn't wait until the divorce. He prepared for it. I scrolled further back. Weeks. Months. The pattern became clearer the longer I looked. The money started disappearing long before we ever sat at the kitchen table talking about growing apart. I thought about all the times he'd said, "We're fine." All the times I'd nodded and believed him. All the times I'd chosen trust over transparency. My hands were shaking now, not because I'd lost money, but because I was realizing something much worse. The man I was divorcing hadn't just left the marriage emotionally. He had been exiting financially while I was still inside it. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence, letting the weight of that settle. The divorce papers were already filed. The calm conversations already happened. The fair agreement already assumed. And I was just now seeing the truth. The marriage hadn't ended quietly. It had been emptied from the inside. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. If he had emptied the account in one move, it would have been obvious, loud, impossible to explain away, but that's not what he did. He was smarter than that. He took it in pieces, small withdrawals, quiet transfers, amounts just low enough to blend into normal spending. A few hundred here, a little more there, spread out over months so nothing ever looked alarming on its own. It was financial erosion, and it worked because I trusted him. I went back through the statements slowly, line by line, the way you do when you're afraid of what you'll find but need the truth anyway. The further back I looked, the clearer it became. The withdrawals lined up with moments in our marriage I remembered well. A weekend he said he needed space, a sudden interest in separating finances later. The months when he felt distant but oddly calm, he wasn't panicking. He was planning. I realized something else too. He never touched our checking account, never interfered with bills or day-to-day expenses. Everything looked normal on the surface. Rent paid, utilities on time, groceries still happening. That was intentional. He didn't want me to notice. He wanted the marriage to feel stable while he quietly made sure his future was protected. My future? That wasn't part of the calculation. The savings account was supposed to be our safety net. Emergency money. The thing that made hard conversations feel less scary because we had a cushion. Every time I thought, at least we'll be okay financially, I was leaning on something that was already disappearing. And he knew it. The worst part wasn't the amount of money, it was the timing. He was draining our savings while we were still saying while we were still married. While I still believed we were on the same side. I remembered one conversation in particular. We were sitting on the couch, talking about how weird it felt to grow apart. At least we've been responsible, I said. At least we set ourselves up okay. He nodded. Yeah, we did. That sentence played in my head now, sharp and bitter. We didn't do anything. He did. By the time I finished reviewing the statements, my hands were cold. Not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't poor communication. It wasn't a mistake made during emotional stress. It was a strategy. He didn't empty the account because that would have raised questions. He didn't tell me because that would have required honesty. He chose the one option that kept him comfortable while leaving me vulnerable. He didn't just take money. He took my sense of safety at the exact moment I needed it most. And suddenly, the calm divorce made sense. He wasn't being reasonable. He wasn't being mature. He was being prepared. I didn't confront him right away. I needed to be sure enough that he couldn't talk his way around it. Sure enough that I wouldn't second-guess myself halfway through the conversation. I printed statements. I highlighted dates. I lined everything up on the dining table like I was preparing for a meeting I never wanted to attend. When I finally asked him to sit down, he looked annoyed more than worried. That told me a lot before he even spoke. "What's going on?" he asked. I slid the papers across the table. I looked at the savings account. He glanced down, too quickly, not confused, recognizing. "It's lower than it should be," I continued. "A lot lower." He leaned back in his chair and exhaled like I'd brought up something inconvenient. Not devastating. "Okay," he said. And, I repeated. "There are months of withdrawals I didn't know about." He shrugged. Actually shrugged. It wasn't that much. That was his first defense. I'm sorry. Not let me explain. Just minimizing. "It adds up," I said, tapping the highlighted lines. "It adds up to a lot." He glanced again, then looked away. I was planning to put it back. "When?" I asked. "After things settled," he said. "After the divorce." There it was. "You were planning to put back money you took without telling me," I said slowly. "After we split?" He frowned. "I needed a buffer. Things were uncertain. So were they for me," I said. "Except I didn't know mine was disappearing." He rubbed his face. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." That was his second defense, turning my reaction into the problem. I didn't take it all at once. he added. I didn't want to scare you. I stared at him, stunned by the logic. You didn't want to scare me? By secretly draining our savings? He didn't answer that. He just kept talking. Look, the marriage was ending. I had to protect myself. There it was again. The word protect. I realized then that he had already justified everything. In his mind, he wasn't stealing. He was preparing. He wasn't lying. He was being practical. And I wasn't a partner. I was an obstacle to manage until the paperwork was done. You never once thought to tell me? I asked. He hesitated. I knew you'd overreact. That sentence ended the conversation, even though we kept talking for another hour, because in that moment, I understood something crucial. He didn't see what he did as wrong. He saw it as smart, necessary, even fair. The confrontation didn't give me closure. It gave me confirmation. By the time I stood up from that table, I knew this wasn't a mistake we could talk through. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a breach that happened quietly and intentionally. While I trusted him to act in good faith, I gathered the papers and said the only thing left to say. My lawyer will be contacting yours. For the first time, he looked alarmed. You don't need to do that, he said quickly. We can work this out. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing but resolve. You already worked it out, I said. Just not with me. The moment lawyers got involved, the tone changed. Not mine, his. What he thought was a private arrangement between two reasonable adults suddenly became a documented pattern. Bank statements stopped being not that much and started being timelines, dates, totals, intent. My attorney didn't sound surprised when I showed her everything. She just nodded slowly and said, This is going to matter. Apparently, courts don't look kindly on one spouse quietly moving money out of joint accounts before or during a divorce. There's a word for it. More than one, actually, and none of them work in his favor. What he thought was preparation looked a lot like concealment. What he thought was smart looked deliberate. What he thought I'd never notice was now printed, organized, and submitted as evidence. The first time his lawyer contacted mine, the language had changed. Gone were the calm suggestions of amicable resolution. Suddenly there were explanations, clarifications, justifications. He was under stress. He intended to return the funds. There was no malicious intent. Intent didn't matter as much as action. During mediation, he wouldn't look at me. He stared at the table, tapping his fingers, like this was all some annoying delay keeping him from moving on. But every time the numbers came up, I saw it in his jaw. Tension, fear. Because for the first time, he wasn't controlling the flow of information. The judge didn't need a dramatic story. The judge needed facts. And the facts were clean, unemotional, and unforgiving. Money removed without disclosure, patterned withdrawals, timing aligned with marital breakdown. The phrase that stuck with me was one my lawyer said quietly afterward. He thought divorce meant freedom. He forgot it also means accountability. The settlement shifted, not in my favor because I was angry, in my favor because the truth was documented. He lost leverage. He didn't realize he was standing on, lost credibility, lost the benefit of the doubt he'd assumed would always belong to him. For the first time since all this started, I saw him unsettled. Not remorseful, unsettled. He had built his exit carefully, assuming I'd stay passive, trusting, quiet, that I'd keep believing the version of him that said everything was fine. He never expected me to look. He never expected the silence around money to end. When it was over, the settlement reflected reality, not his version of it. Some of the money came back, not all of it, but enough to change the balance, enough to remind him that secrecy has limits. Walking out of that building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear, because this was never just about money. It was about learning that someone who controls information controls outcomes. until they don't. And the moment I stopped assuming fairness and started demanding transparency was the moment his plan collapsed. After everything was finalized, people kept asking me the same question. How did you not notice? They didn't mean it cruelly. Most of them were genuinely confused. From the outside, it looked like I had handed over my future without checking the fine print. And in a way, I had. But here's the truth I didn't understand until it was over. I wasn't careless. I was trusting. I believed that marriage meant transparency by default. That if something were wrong, I would be told. That silence meant stability, not secrecy. I thought love made honesty automatic. It doesn't. What I learned, too late for him, but not for me, is that money reveals character long before words do. Anyone can say, "We're fine." Anyone can promise fairness. But behavior leaves a trail, and numbers don't lie when you finally look at them. I learned that shared accounts don't mean shared control, and trust without access is just blind faith. I also learned something harder to admit. He didn't suddenly become dishonest at the end. He had been comfortable with imbalance long before the divorce. I just didn't see it because I didn't want to. I wanted the version of us that felt safe to be real. The quiet betrayal wasn't the draining of the account. It was the decision to protect himself while letting me believe I was protected too. Starting over wasn't easy. I didn't just rebuild my finances. I rebuilt my sense of agency. I asked more questions. I checked more often. I stopped equating transparency with distrust. And I stopped apologizing for wanting clarity. As for him, I heard later that he told people the divorce got complicated, that it was harder than it needed to be, that things didn't go the way he expected. That part always stayed with me, because he expected my silence to carry him through the ending the same way it carried him through the marriage. It didn't. The money mattered, but what mattered more was the lesson. If someone avoids questions about shared resources, they're not protecting peace. They're protecting power. And if you ever find yourself trusting without verifying, remember this. Look early, ask often, and never confuse calm with honesty. Because sometimes the most damaging betrayal doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It comes with numbers quietly disappearing, and the assumption you'll never notice until it's too late.